So I'm going to just kind of start all over again there. So basically, I started my journey in 2005 and or 2006, and in 2017, I asked myself some really difficult and important questions, and in the end, I found that this led me to dedicating my career to youth development, and currently, I am supporting youth academies. At the moment, mainly in football and soccer, and I'm helping build infrastructure and developmental programs for these academies. So my aim is to help develop the next generations of athletes and ultimately teach them how to manage themselves. Because I think that a missing part in our industry is giving the athletes and the players the autonomy to manage themselves so they have a long career.
Perfect. So my first question to you almost answered my first question. So I was watching a presentation that you gave in World Speed Summit 2016. So towards the end of the video, you made a statement saying your next 5 years of your career, you would like to dedicate to scale LTAT model. So is there a background story behind that? How did it all start? You work with elite pro athletes. So from that, how did you shift to narrowing down your practice to developmental stage athletes?
Yeah. Well, it started, I guess, from my upbringing. I was an athlete myself, and the truth is, athletics was the way that I was able to fund my college education. So it was a dual effort from my family, but mainly with my father and I, to find a way to fund my college education. And as you may or may not know, in the U.S., university is very expensive, and it was just our plan. He told my other siblings that we could do it with academics, music, athletics, and of course, I chose athletics. So it's been a large part of my personal life to use sport to enhance my own life. So I for sure 100% started back then with my personal upbringing. And then in 2006, when I did an internship at Mike Boyle Strength and Conditioning, and then after that, of course, worked there for 6 years, we had a very demanding schedule. Until this day, the schedule is almost the same. You spend your morning hours, early hours, working with small group personal training. Then you have a block where you're working with professional athletes. And then across the day, you had opportunities to work with youth athletes. And yeah, I identified back in 2006 that this was a population that I felt very engaged with, and I felt the need to support. And of course, my journey took me a lot of different directions, working across many different levels of sport. And I've been involved with highly funded organizations, and I've been involved with low funded organizations. And I think my goal, because let's be honest, when it comes to youth development, or developing countries that are just starting with S&C, there's no funding involved. So you have to be really creative with being effective with meeting your goals. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of how it all started.
Great, great. So to get the ball rolling, I was having a very interesting chat with my colleague Surabhi today. So I'll let her take the lead from here. So Surabhi, would you mind just asking the question that we both were discussing a couple of hours back?
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Hi, Nicole. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Okay, so today I was just chatting to Abhi about this, and I just went through Rodri Lloyd's paper, and it said something on the lines of you need to work on your fundamentals. Like any athlete that comes through your door, you need to work on their fundamentals, build a nice strong base of fundamentals upon which they will then build their complex movement skills, right? And everybody pretty much agrees with this. But then I was just thinking about this a little bit deeper, and something else came to my mind. I just thought about countries where S&C is not so developed. For example, let's take Fiji and Fiji rugby, for example. You give a Fijian kid a rugby ball and ask them to go through the try line with a defender in front of them, they'll easily be able to execute a complex task of just sidestepping that person to next week and going and scoring a try. Which makes me again question our emphasis on fundamental movement skills. Are we actually emphasizing too much on building the base? And I don't know, maybe we should just let the game handle all the movement skills. And my question being, can we make use of that time for something more meaningful instead of working on their fundamental movement patterns? So for example, working on your jumping, your landing, force absorption, your snap downs and all of that jazz. Mm-hmm. Do you really need to do all of that? Do you really need to work on their fundamental movement patterns when they can actually perform the complex skills without any background in fundamental movement skills? Mm-hmm. So I was just racking my brain on that today.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that's trends that we have seen in countries like Brazil, countries I've seen in Argentina and Mexico, where they do have this nature of free play. Perhaps in your example, right, the athletes in Fiji, they do have this element of free play, and those fundamental movement skills are taken care of during those times of free play. On the other hand, and I'll just speak now in my personal experience here in Poland, I work at a professional academy where many hours are dedicated to playing one sport, in this case, football. And, and then we take a look at these fundamental movement skills that we want them to be able to do, and they're not able to accomplish that. And so with the Fiji example that you just proposed to the group, I would wonder in that situation, if you take an athlete who has had this brilliant luxury of having this enormous free play, and then assess them in these fundamental movement skills that Rodri Lloyd and Dr. John Oliver were discussing in their paper, can they perform them? And usually the answer is, yes. But I think it depends on the environmental background, because I can say here, with the young developing athletes that we have, and they're as young as 8 years old, 8, 9, 10, 11 plus, in the younger stages, that's simply lacking. So in that situation, yes, it needs to be inserted, because the truth is, at least in an organized sporting environment like the one we work with, okay, they need to play their sport, but they also need to pass pretty extensive medical tests. And those medical tests are based off of these fundamental movement skills. So the medical professionals can make sure that they're checking all of the boxes. So we're doing it for a lot of different reasons. Ultimately, we're trying to ensure that they have basic function. And let's just talk about the spine, right? Can they dissociate lower body from upper body? Okay, with a 11-year-old athlete, it's going to be difficult to ask them to do different pelvic tilts and circles unless you're asking them to hula hoop, which I ask my kids to hula hoop. So basically, what do? You put them in a quadruped position and see if they can do a fundamental movement skill such as a cat camel exercise. So I think the environment will dictate the learning abilities from the athletes. But let's be honest, at least in my situation in the US, in different parts of Europe, uh, nowadays, for some reason, because it was different from when I grew up, kids aren't exposed to that and they don't have those freedoms. So, therefore, we do have to teach those mental movement skills. And if they are showing, let's say, for example, at 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old, before they enter in their various stages of growth and maturation, if they're showing, hey, I can do these fundamental movements, great. We can move on to other tasks. But most of the time, they're not being able to demonstrate that. So therefore, we do have to support that. So it's an environmental question, like what environment did they grow up in, because I know in my situation, watching kids in Mexico and Brazil, most of the time they're playing with their shoes off in various surfaces that aren't perfect, like the football pitch that we train here in Poland. And so I think it depends on the environment. But in short, I do think that we do need to leave room for those fundamental movement skills, because what's happening in the real world, as I'm sure is happening in India, when you get into an organized sport environment, specialization is the top priority. And so all they're doing is playing that one sport. So therefore, I believe that our role as movement mechanics, as physical development coaches, is to kind of provide those other sport-like activities, or I would like to say movement variability, because they're not getting that movement variability the way that you just explained in your example with the athlete coming from Fiji. So it all comes down to movement variability.
Hmm.
But
That
in
makes
my
sense.
experience, I'm finding that the kids are in a professional football academy and aren't able to demonstrate those fundamental movement skills. So,
Fair enough. Makes sense. Thanks
yeah,
for that.
yeah, you're welcome.
Great. Anand, if you're online, in the survey that we filled up, you had a very interesting point about encouraging free play versus multi-sport participation. Would you mind expanding upon it a little more?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Hi, Nicole. Thanks for chipping in today. And great conversation so far. So, my question was pertaining to the dynamics in the LTAD and YPD type of environment. And the idea is to see if it is viable to incorporate a concept of replay, which has minute levels of coaching involved. And the logic is, especially in the growing age, from 8 to 12 years old, the neural plasticity is something that can be taken advantage of. And coupled with that, the current lifestyle where the opportunities for kids to have unregimented playtime without any intervention or coaching is quite limited. And you gave a great example of Mexican and Brazilian football players playing on different surfaces. And there is a reason why Latin American football players are consistently successful at the international level. And for me, in my mind, that reason is I'm just drawing comparisons with cultures in India and those countries with regards to different sports, but at the similar magnitude. And the reason for that is I feel that non-regimented play at the youth, street football in Brazil or other South American countries, or street cricket in India, where players or youth in general just go out there and compete against each other and free for all kind of situation. Similar situation in basketball in US, where there are rolling basketball tournaments happening in the nooks and corners of New York City and other cities. And
Yeah.
that's where players actually grow up. And with all the academies and high performance institutes catering to youth athlete development, that free play is the concept of free play is really going down, uh, which I feel that can be thoughts on that.
Mhm. I agree with you. Um, I think when I think the reality of modern day sport is extremely organized. Um, and I don't think that we're going to change that much, especially in more developed countries, from a strength and conditioning and sport perspective. So I don't think that that's going away. I think it's actually just going to increase in terms of how much contact time they are within that organized environment. In this example, I think it's only going to get worse. um, I agree with you. And, with the question that was proposed earlier, that free play is the most is the easiest way to have changes of plasticity, is the easiest way to stimulate key factors that youth athletes need to experience. For example, the stretch shortening cycle. They need to be exposed to various levels of stretch shortening cycle to be able to express their body in nature. Which is one of the reasons why, when, let's say, I have a 15-minute time block to work with athletes, from a program design perspective, because I'm in an organized environment, the way that I would organize that is, from a programming perspective, it would be uh, similar to the whole part, whole model that was proposed many years ago from a motor learning standpoint. But for kids, for youth athletes, it would be a compete, teach, compete model. Okay. Because there is going to be an element of teaching involved. Like, I'm going to have to teach them certain movements, but I'm going to allow them to express and feel those movements under that game like free play sort of situation. Now, unless it's a day where we're playing a completely new sport and the kids have to figure out how to play this particular sport, um, unless they're coming to training early, unfortunately, in an organized bubble, which is what I work in, you're not going to have a lot of those opportunities for free play. Because even when they're playing their match and competing, right, they're young kids, so they're learning the structure, they're learning the moments of the game and the rules of the game. So technically, although it is more organic than their other training, either physical development or football, it's still not free play the way we understand free play. But again, I think that's missing from the world. And personally, I think that falls under parents So I think addressing this question and the previous question, I think that more education needs to be inserted for parents specifically, and showing examples and providing insights with the importance of free play, and making sure that they can experience that throughout their growing years. So to answer this question and to go back to the previous question, because I think they're actually very similar questions. um, the free play aspect allows for that true creativity and expression of movement. But I think that happens outside the structured academies that I work in, at least. So, but I agree with you. I agree with you, but personally, I don't think that happens within our roles. I think that happens inside the home and the household.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. But I think the person, and I'm just going to say one more thing, I think the person who creates, because those resources haven't been created yet in terms of parent education, early specialization, how that can block their mind and perhaps their movements, which that's been proven through research. I haven't seen many research papers that can scientifically prove why free play is the most important aspect of a child's life. But I think if and when that ever happens, you throw that in front of the parents, and I think we might have a little bit more success. But growing up, that's how I grew up, and I've been very healthy throughout my personal journey as being an athlete and now a coach. But growing up, that was the only way that we played up until the age of about 15, 16. So personally, I believe that until our children go through the second phase of development, right? So we have our foundation stage, roughly around U9, U11, our development stage, U12 through U15, which is where the growth and maturation period occurs. And then you have your performance stage, U16 plus. I think up until they exit that development stage, post, right, pubertal athletes, I think that free play should always be a part of their training, but it just doesn't exist anymore. So therefore, like I said earlier, from a programming perspective, I like to program more of a compete, teach, compete type model.
Excellent. Thanks. Yeah, we know.
Yeah. Thank you, Anand. That was a good, brilliant question. Anyone else? I mean, the floor is open. Anyone among the participants can shoot the question.
Well, can I ask a question for the audience?
Absolutely.
What does free play look like in India? How are the young athletes, I guess, experience that, or is it gone now in India as well as it is in other parts of the world?
I'm on mute. Anyone can take the question, please.
For me, free play in India, sorry, Shresi.
Go ahead.
I'll be quick, I promise. I can just think of cricket on the street, to be honest, and probably a little bit of football here and there. Otherwise, nothing really.
I was actually going to say quite exactly what Surabhi just said, because the irony of free play in India is that it's actually specialization, because everybody just wants to play cricket. So even if there is some amount of free play that used to exist, I would say maybe a decade ago, I think off late, it's probably just cricket and, like she said, a little bit more of football. So the issue again with free play is the fact that it's one particular sport.
Yeah. Could I go?
Yeah, I'll just add on to both what Surbhi and someone wants to go.
Yeah, go ahead, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just add to what Surbhi and Shreyas
You
was
finish.
saying. So yeah, cricket, yes, that's the main sport that is part of the free play, and that's also part of the problem. I feel why the youth physical development in other sports doesn't seem to be as strong in the country, because cricket by nature is a sport. Uh, just by playing it, you would develop very limited vocabulary of physical movements, because the game is more tactical and skill oriented, uh, and the movement patterns of that game are quite unique, peculiar, and mostly unilateral. So most of our kids do play free play uh, type games, but the physical development doesn't really augur that well. Had they been playing games like basketball, soccer, or rugby, and so on and so forth. If they want to develop as cricketers, the free play would definitely help. But that's not the point of the discussion, because from the global athletic development perspective, playing even the cricket as a free play is not really as beneficial as playing other sports. So that's another problem with India.
Okay, so you guys are experiencing similar things as other parts of the world as well. Okay.
Yeah, so I would like to add a point. One major factor dictating how much free play the person gets is the socioeconomic status over here. So if you notice closely, the people from the rural backgrounds or even slightly lesser economically good background, they tend to get more exposure to rough environments where they are forced to climb over walls, jump over trees, run barefoot, and play some games which they invent by themselves, or it has been culturally rooted inside. So they play a game called Top. They play with a similar to a Beyblade like in the US. So you have to a lot of nuanced actions happening within the very constrained environment. So they have a very minimal tools, but are still exposed to rough play in a constrained environment. And those are the kids who, if the right coaches see them, seem to develop into good athletes, which I feel the socioeconomic upbringing and the environment they are forced to live in is contributing to their overall growth in a longer time frame.
Mm-hmm. Well summarized. Thank you. Well summarized for the last two questions, to be honest. Thank you very much for that.
Good point, Akib.
And
Thank you so much.
And I really think, right, the question, and that's what, our goal is to provide with our structured environments, and the youth development model that Dr. John Oliver and Rodri Lloyd proposed. You see at the bottom of that, it says from basically the foundation stage, pre growth and maturation, right? It should be a no structured. Okay. Then as they progress, semi structured. And then as they progress, moderately and high structured. So they make those recommendations to be, not structured or semi structured type environments. But what I think personally we need to do a better job of is just working more with kids, because I think when we can get a better understanding of how kids operate, we can then better design more game-based type movements. But I think the truth is, I don't think a lot of coaches have the access and the ability to work with kids, because, in my example, my situation is a clear example. I jumped right into, amateur and professional sports. That's just kind of what we all gravitate to. And who's coaching our kids? The parents are coaching the kids. So it has not been, in my experience, um, a career or a population where you can make a good living wage working with kids. So therefore, I think it's as simple as we don't know how to work with kids and we don't have enough experience working with kids. That's why we have to create these guidelines of, okay, we want a non-structured environment or a semi-structured environment, which is basically saying we want them to be organic with how we're operating our training sessions. So I think those libraries of game-based movements need to be increased. And you know, we're working on it, and I think we're all of us as an industry. That's what I mean by we. I think we're getting better, but really the goal is to create high sensory rich environments, right, through the use of games and tactile forces and, like you said earlier, rough and tumble play. I think those libraries are slowly building, but I personally think the problem is not enough experienced coaches are working with kids. So therefore, all we can say is, okay, let's put them in a room and let them play on their own, and that simply doesn't transfer to what the coaches actually need to do. So global problem, I think.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. When you were answering Surabhi's first question, you were talking about developing different movement qualities. Do you prescribe a certain window of opportunity to develop certain qualities based on peak height velocity? Like, let's say you're going to work on endurance during the offset of peak height velocity or strength post peak height velocity. Do you think a window of opportunity actually exists? And if at all we miss the window of opportunity, are we missing out a big, are we, are we missing out something big?
Mm-hmm. Uh, Very good question. I don't believe in those windows of opportunity. Um, there's only been one research study to date, I believe 2018, 2019, from the Netherlands, that, and I can share that, and you guys can all have access. It's an open access research paper that basically is stating that there's no evidence or research to prove that windows of opportunities exist. And I've always believed that. And although we want to ensure that, for example, a U9 player, okay, we want to make sure that they're getting opportunities to run as fast as possible, okay, because we know that that's when their stretch shortening cycle abilities and their neuromuscular abilities are starting to develop. So in that case, the window of opportunity of introducing speed makes sense, but all we're trying to do is give them opportunities to run as fast as possible, because in organized sports they're forced to play in a box. They're forced to do a drill where they're only running 3 meters this way and 3 meters that way, right? They're no longer running naturally a 15-meter race course, whatever the case is. So therefore the stretch shortening cycle isn't able to develop. So in short, I don't believe that those windows exist. I think if you have a sedentary child who then tries to play sports at 14 years old, okay, that's going to be much more difficult. But it's not because he didn't hit the right window of opportunity. I think it's just because he has not had enough physical movement. So I don't believe in that. I believe that we should be training all general motor abilities, and giving them opportunities. And whether that's, if you look at an Arsenal Football Academy, right, they're openly and proudly and very successfully teaching young 11, 12-year-old athletes the basics of Olympic lifting. Okay, they're highly resourced, highly funded, so they have a lot of people. Well, that may not be the case for me here in Poland. If I want to teach the basics of Olympic lifting, I'm having them lift a simple medicine ball and going through their full ranges of motion. So I don't think that those windows exist. I do believe that we can easily start to do basic strength with young athletes when the research says that that comes later in their development. And you know who is doing the best job, in my opinion, is Mike Boyle. Mike Boyle, his son now I think is about 15 or 16 years old, but his son has been doing basic strength training since he was 8, 9 years old. And it's interesting because Mike Boyle has had one population, basically his son and all of his friends, training, right? Multiple months out of the year at the training facility, and all of them have exceeded their predicted adult height. Most of them, Mike has said, that are taller than their parents. So then you have to kind of wonder, ooh, like growth hormones come into effect, and that didn't stunt their growth, which research in the past from the 80s and 90s said that if you lift weights with young kids, it's going to stunt their growth. Well, that simply, I don't believe that that's true. And the current research now is saying that those windows of opportunities maybe aren't valid as they were once proposed. So I don't personally agree with that.
Great, Nicole. Hi, I'm also a CFSC level 2, so I went to Michael Boyle. I was also offered an internship there, but Trump happened, unfortunately. I really love the conversation which is going around free play, but my question here is that how do you control external factors in terms of how do you buy in from parents, how do you buy in from coaches? Because in terms of structured coaching, wherein a lot of people are associated with certain institutions, I myself am a private practitioner. So I am answerable to parents in terms of if this is something which is unstructured and is a so-called fair play scenario, why am I sending my kid to you? Because I thought you're a specialist and a free play is something that, my kid can anyway do it in school or, rather somewhere else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So how do you basically create that buy-in? If you have how do you create that balance?
Yeah, I know. Really good questions. You know, can I ask you what age? Can you give me an age frame right now that we want to discuss?
Anywhere between 10 to 16.
Okay. 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 So they come to my academy, our academy. They come to your training facility, and parents, don't want them to just be running freely because they can basically do that at home, which they don't do. Right. So that's kind of the situation. How do we get buy-in from the coaches and the parents that we work with? Okay. Now, the first thing in my experience, because the youngest athlete that I work with right now is a U8 team. Okay, so right now there's only about 13 of them, but that's the youngest athlete that I currently work with. In my experience, to get coaches' approval, to get parents' approval, the kids have to be moving and having fun. That's number one. And I know that's kind of a simple, of course answer, like, of course, Nicole, the kids want to be moving and having fun. But the truth is, when you're training younger athletes, even, around 10 years old, that's not always the case. So that's obviously the first goal is, how are we engaging with the young athletes? Second is, can the kids display basic attention abilities? And it's interesting because I believe, or my experience has shown, that the attentional ability from the kids, and I won't discuss what happens at home because I don't know what happens at home, but in our situation, relies mainly on the demands of the head coach. So if we have a U11 team and the head coach of that team doesn't require, right, basic attentional needs, then when they come to me, it doesn't work. So having fun and keeping the kids engaged and being able to have their attention. Now you're probably saying, okay, how do you do that with young kids? Well, first off, like has already been stated, we create the right environment. If it's a chaotic environment, there's not going to be any success or any teaching. To go back to the original question is, how do we get buy-in from parents and coaches? We have to show that we're operating kind of like a yo-yo, right? We let them go out and we let them loose, but then we're able to bring them back in, right? We let them play, we let them express their movements with whatever competition, movement skills we're trying to teach, but then we're able to successfully bring them back in and manage them, so to speak. So I always say it's kind of like a yo-yo, right? I bring them close. I give them the 1 or 2 points that I want them to try to feel. I maybe highlight a couple of things, and then I just let them go and let them kind of freely move and play and do X, Y, and Z movement that I want them to do. So the buy-in, in my experience, comes with showing that you can manage a large group of athletes. In my case, anywhere between 14 to 23 athletes at once. And so I really think it all comes down to management. Because I do not speak Polish fluently, I had to come up with signals. So imagine that you have 23 U12 players, so very young in my opinion, 23 U12 players, and you're trying to get them organized. Shouting is not going to work. Okay, shouting just isn't going to work. So you have to start to teach them, okay, guys, when I want you, and this goes back to the buy-in, right? I think parents and coaches buy in when you can show that you can manage their players. Okay, so I basically say, okay, if I want them to get in a small circle so I can explain the task that I want them to do, whether it's structured for a U16 player or semi-structured for a U10, 12 player, basically, right? Small circle is here. Big circle is this signal. And so they can basically just boom, all 23 of them get in a big circle, and we're able to perform our drill, our task, our game. If I want them to split into 2 lines, so if I have 23 players, I'll say, okay, 11 of you guys on this side, 12 of you guys on this side, but that's this orientation. So I just kind of throw my hands out and they know, boom, they go into that orientation. And I find that the quicker I can organize them, the more fun we can have, the more that we can do, and the more buy-in our parents and athletes have. So for me, it's all about being a yo-yo with the athletes, letting them go, bringing them in, letting them go, bringing them in. Because the truth is, I don't know how it is at your training facility. I have 15, maybe 30 minutes to work with a foundation or development athlete, and that's not a lot of time. And so we have to be effective with how we manage them, and obviously not making them feel like they're a part of the Polish army, but being able to be just, structured. And if they don't have the basic attentional needs, which that's actually the situation I have with one of my teams, they just, as one large team, they don't have those capabilities. So then that's when we just break them up into groups. Okay, I only take 7, the head coach takes 7, they do, X, Y, and Z sports specific movement, right? I'm going to do my physical development work, and then we just switch. But I think it's all about showing the parents and the coaches that you can let them go, but you can also bring them in.
Thanks, Nicole.
Pleasure.
Hi, Nicole. It's been great listening to everything you've been having to say. Just a quick question along the lines of early specialization. So early specialization is something that has been, theoretically discussed quite a bit, and it's something that's we're trying to get coaches and parents to try and understand why we don't want children to specialize that early on. But apart from the theoretical part of it, practically speaking, at least in many countries, like for instance in India, where a sport like cricket is probably the only big sport that is there, practically to actually implement it and say play less of your sport and maybe engage in other sports or engage in other activities, immediately comes across to the coach as, oh, then what if my athlete is not as skilled as another 14-year-old that's been doing it for the last 6-7 years? So, and the problem with a sport like cricket is that a majority of cricketers, at least in India, are highly skilled. They perform really well, but they may not be the greatest of athletes. So in a scenario like this, to come forth and try and convince them that their athletic ability is going to help them in the long run, that's one problem, one side of the problem. But along with that, the other question I also had was, at what age do we sort of have a demarcation as to the job of an S&C versus the job of the coach itself? Because many sports, like for instance track and field, the coach kind of takes care of every element of that athlete's sporting life, like right from nutrition to what kind of training to everything is taken care of that one coach. So would it confuse an 8-year-old to listen to a coach, an S&C, and then their parent? So do we do we maybe empower the coaches to handle them until a certain age, and then we as S&C step in? Or are we confusing the children by too many people, too many parties being involved in that athlete's life? So that's
an amazing question. Good. Okay. Thank you for that. I think everyone agrees that that's a really good question. I believe so. I'm 37 years old. I have a good amount of experience as being an athlete myself in my coaching career. I had this epiphany a couple of years ago when I moved to Europe in 2017. And this epiphany was that I was trying to, and I've always believed in education, and I've been doing education since 2012. And I told myself at a relatively younger age, ooh, I want to learn how to educate because I think that I will be more impactful as a human being if I'm able to help educate other S&C coaches, physical development coaches, so they can then work with their athletes. That was my original goal. And then I had this epiphany where I was just like, now I'm working outside of highly funded organizations, okay, where we don't have S&C coaches, physical development coaches to support. So the sport coach has to manage all of the variables, as you just mentioned. And then I had this like aha moment where I was just like, whoa, my direction needs to change. I need to be educating the sport coaches on how to do the basic elements of S&C and physical development, um, because the most successful, the most influential S&C coaches that I know are actually hybrids. They do both the rehab, right? They do the S&C and they do the sport specific work. Okay. And I think us as coaches, so let's just say we have on this call 3 mixed martial art coaches, 4 cricket coaches, 2 football coaches, and 1 wrestling coach. I think that if we are all S&C coaches and physical development coaches, we should aspire to be assistant coaches in whatever sport that you're playing. That's what I think we need. After, of course, we cover the basic S&C principles that we need to know. I think if you decide I want to work in cricket, then I think, of course, you still continue to develop your coaching, your knowledge on S&C, but I would almost challenge every coach to have the mindset to get prepared to be an assistant sport coach, and in this case, cricket. I think that's the direction that we need to go so we can manage both ends of the continuum and there's not that confusion that you just eloquently described from our athletes. So they're getting it from one source, because growing up, I got it from one source, my father. He cooked for me. He played with me. He trained with me. Like, he did everything. So it is easier when you have that one voice. And that is why, for me, it was a requirement on my side. Okay, I'm going to join this highly organized football organization. My goal is not to train the kids. My goal is to teach the coaches how to help manage the kids. So therefore, the coaches have to be involved at every single session. Because to your point, when it's S&C time, the coaches disappear. No, that's not the mindset, or that's not the environment we should be creating. When we do the S&C coach, the coach is there training with us. He's now my assistant coach. And then I'm his assistant coach, right? When we're on the field together. That, I think, is the right combination that I think we're still very much 10 years away from, a very long time. So, amazing question. Thank you. Does anyone else have anything to add to that one? Because that was a really good question.
I think that that's a great discussion to have, because I usually work with a lot of tennis athletes. It's very, very difficult commercially for an athlete to afford a coach, strength and conditioning coach, a nutritionist or a psychologist to travel with. So what has happened actually in the Europe is a lot of tennis coaches have, because in India it doesn't take a lot of time to become a tennis coach, but I think in Europe it's a good 2-year program wherein these guys have to go through the entire sports science study along with their skill practice. What happens? What's the major advantage there is that when the coach is actually traveling with the athlete, he can take care of strength and conditioning and of course the skill part of it. But a great question here to have is that if we all are investing so much into masters and into our education, are we on the path of losing our jobs?
Mhm.
So
I don't think that that's going to happen personally. I um I don't have any fear that the coaches that I work with will will basically take over and do my, like, no, I don't have any fear with that. I think that's when we have to be player centered, right? We're not thinking about my job. He's not thinking about his job. We're thinking about how this affects the player. But that takes some time to build that environment, because coaches are concerned with how many wins and losses they have, and things like that. But I think if we are player centered, that wouldn't happen. So I wouldn't worry about that.
that makes sense.
Actually, Nicole, you said the coach and the strength and conditioning coach should work hand in hand. But in most of the cases, when you see an under 14 or a under 16 teams, does not have an experienced strength and conditioning coach. They usually have a budding strength and conditioning coach, or who's just off the, somebody who's so fresh. So probably the coach does not believe in him. Probably that's the reason why he does not work with a novice SNC. Probably if all the youth teams have experienced strength and conditioning coaches, probably they would listen and all these things would change eventually.
No, that's a good point. That's a good point. And that is the difficulty with, again, as I stated earlier, working in youth sport. There's no funding for it. So our best coaches aren't working with our youth athletes, right? They're working at the Olympic Training Center. They're working with the professional teams. And in my perfect world scenario in my head, like, that's why I want to dedicate the next 10 to 15 years of my career, so we can make training, youth development, an actual viable, industry. So we can have a healthy, normal, successful life while we're working with kids, because our best coaches are not working with kids. So it's a good point.
I think another question that I have is, you know, so I was, so when we sort of do a lot of assessments with kids, we tend to have number one is quantifiable justification of data. I was, but do you think can we head in a direction wherein we can sort of show them that uh, more than quantification, what matters is the movement quality that eventually you have improved on. What are your thoughts on it? If if you want me to ask the second question, my second question is that uh, you've got a lot of experience working with people or athletes in a lot of different countries and a lot of different continents. Uh, but for example, if I'm working with a 12-year-old tennis athlete and doing X, Y, Z amount of assessment or test, uh, I'm still not convinced that can I compare a European or an American normative data with an Indian data. So, do you think that there is some sort of a misinformation out there, or have you seen different populations reacting differently to
Yeah,
different training stimulus?
that's the conversation that is going on currently in the UK regarding growth and maturation percentages, right? They're all done on Caucasian boys and girls, right? Which is different when you start to work with other nationalities and different cultures. So yes, there is a difference with that. And it all comes down to funding, right? If someone threw out a couple of million euros to India to have research and development happen there, well, then we would have more specific data. But currently, that doesn't exist. So yes, I think there are absolutely differences from a cultural standpoint. And then regarding the first question, it wasn't all that clear, but I believe you were talking about assessments and quantifying the data and how we communicate that to the athlete.
Yeah.
The athlete wants to see progress. Human beings want to see progress, right? Tony Robbins will say progress equals happiness. And so, yes, if you're jump testing or doing a drop jump test on an athlete to look at different landing forces, yeah, they want to see that the next time that they have some sort of progress or they're not getting worse. And so I think ultimately that doesn't matter to the players. I think the players only care about what happens on the pitch and how successful they are on the pitch. But from an education standpoint, we very much want to be sharing that data with them and that information to help keep them informed about their physical health and to help tell the story on why they might need to be doing supplemental movements or exercises to help fill that gap. So I think that we still, as an industry, need to do better quantifying what we do. But I think that we're going in the right direction with that. And as Tony Holler and Mike Boyle will say, right, record, rank, publish. You know, we record it, we rank it, and we publish it. So we're letting the athletes understand the information that we're collecting.
Sure.
And competing. Yeah.
Hi, Nicole. Such a pleasure talking to you in person. My question is on those lines of testing and monitoring, like how so much of importance is given to testing and monitoring in the LTAT model. At each stage, how they emphasize that should be done. I mean, as we know that the best way to do such testing and monitoring is in a laboratory setting where we have like expensive biomechanical equipments like force plates or optoelectronic to get those details and the data to you. But at the same time, if you look at athletes who are just starting to compete, who might not have the access to such laboratories, or because of the expenses or because of not being able to port those devices to on field. How do you think such athletes can, or can you give an example of such instances of how you have done testing and monitoring on athletes on field, especially where we have research that suggests that why on-field testing is more important rather than laboratory-based testing? And this kind of would help to improve the ecological validity of the results and not just making it in a confined environment in the laboratory. So how do you think it works in different places?
Yeah, that's to me where the researchers are trying to get to, and simply from a technology standpoint, it's not there. So right, the researchers are trying, kind of like a force plate sole within the football shoe. And so simply, I don't think research is there yet from that perspective to be able to assess and monitor the way we would in a laboratory. So if we're looking at comparing a force plate, data or information from, let's say, a drop jump, and being able to say, well, it's more important for me to see how he absorbs that force when he changes direction on the pitch. Well, there's only, one or two institutions that have force plates within the grass or the turf. So I just don't think that we're there yet. And from your point, it's all about an expense. So when you don't have any resources, it's difficult. If I, at a highly funded youth academy, I have access to force plates. Well, if I no longer have that highly funded academy and I'm now at a low funded academy, well then I can't now measure drop landing forces. All I can measure is, jump height or jump distance if we're doing something like a broad jump. So of course that is not, you can't compare those two, but simply we're definitely not there yet where we can evaluate and assess and monitor on pitch. I think that technology needs to be created. We have steps towards it. For example, there's a UK-based company originally from Israel, I believe. They're called Player Maker. And basically, it's a strap that they put around the shoe that will monitor technical aspects of the game, passes completed, speed of the force of the kick, speed of the run, deceleration, little basic, features like that. So that's one way of doing it, but I just think from a technology standpoint, we're really far away with that. So all you can do, in my experience, if you're in a low funded environment, is be able to assess basic things like movement quality. So for example, in one academy that I work with that isn't highly funded, every quarter we go through speed testing. Okay, we do a movement quality test, we do a speed test, and then they go through some sort of football test. Well, all I have are timing gates. So that only gives me one thing, which is time. And so what I do is I make it a point to record that 10-meter or 20-meter run, right? Because the only unit of measure I'm going to get is obviously velocity and time. But from a movement quality standpoint, and we're talking about youth athletes right now, right? We want to ensure that they're able to run in a particular way where they are expressing the use of their stretch shortening cycle. Because it's interesting when you find, or when you're working with youth athletes who cannot display that, right? They look like they're glued to the ground, they're running really low. And so basically all we can do from a movement quality standpoint is be able to capture that through video analysis. But I'm with you. We're not there yet, but I think that is certainly the direction that I see more and more researchers trying to do. The problem is the tools that are being created aren't measuring what they say they're trying to measure, and it's simply not reliable the way now force plates are very reliable. So that technology piece, I think, is very important. But to your point, you have to have some funding to do that.
Yeah, right. I think it'll be interesting to see how, like, even though we're talking about soles or devices that you put in your shoes to detect motion or movement, again, those are things that one needs to go and buy, or one needs to go and invest. Again, that expenses come, but it'd be interesting to see how, like, mobile applications could be used to do such things. Like, since you have high-speed video recording, and seeing how that could be maneuvered to measure movements. So I think, yeah, what you said, I get it.
Yeah, no, I'll leave it up to you to start creating the next best technology for that, because that's the problem, right? You know, my dream, and I'll just say this last point, like, as a coach, we have our tool bag, right? Our tool bag has some soft tissue tools, some belts and bungees, maybe some balls, whatever, right? You have our basic equipment that we use for S&C. Well, it's impossible for me. Let's say I go work for a low-funded organization, right? It would be nice if I could bring my own force plate with me and bring my own timing gates and bring my own cameras to do video analysis. But I mean, my first coaching bag cost maybe 400 euro, right? With all the 500 euro with all the tools. And this coaching bag would cost me 20,000 plus euro. And so basically those tools are just not accessible yet. But that's like one of my long-term goals. It's like, okay, how do I provide accessible testing, reliable equipment that we could now start to do both, right? The assessment and monitoring and the physical training. But that hasn't been created yet, but that's something that needs to be, because it's just not accessible for the world.
Right, right. Makes sense.
So
Thank
I
you so
don't
much.
really have an answer for that other than analyzing the biomechanics and the movement and being able to get basic, jump height and distances and things like that. So there's,
Right.
so.
All right. Thank you for that.
Good, good. Well, I want to be respectful for everyone's time. I say we take maybe another 5-7 minutes of chatting, questions, anything, and then we'll call it a session here. But I'm open for you guys for another at least 10 minutes. So if there's anything else, I would love to discuss.
Nicole, I have a question for you. So this is on the lines of growth and maturation.
Mm-hmm.
So as you train different athletes, you know that the chronological age and the biological age differences. So what is your opinion on biobanding? Do you think grouping the athletes based on growth and maturation attributes rather than ages is good? Does it nullify the physical bias that a lot of kids face?
Yes. I believe that that's going to be the future. They're doing extensive work currently in the UK because, again, it's highly funded. Good for them. But basically, they're just trying to compare apples to apples. And I think the easiest way is to take the basic performance measures that you take, whether that's jump height, whether that's 10-meter speed, whatever measures that you're taking, from a strength and power perspective, bench press if you're in that, squatting, whatever it is. And basically what you're trying to do is first identify out of your 20 players in your U14 team, okay, which players are in each category, right? Pre, during, post. And then from there, you can start to, from a performance perspective, start to measure apples to apples, right? So categorize all of the athletes who in the U14 team are in the pre growth spurt, and then compare performance measures there, and then so forth and so on. And from a playing perspective, what happens in the real world is, let's say you're playing with the U14 squad. Well, for most days of the week, they're training with the U14 team. But if we identify that these 4 players are growth phase, then those players can either play down in age or up in age, depending on what the goals are. Usually in this case, if they're pre, they're going to be playing down in age, so they can experience different levels of play. And then same thing if you're working with the U14 team, who you have 2 players that are post growth spurt. Well, then same thing, on a daily basis, they're going to be practicing with their U14 team, but maybe on the weekend, they're playing up an age to the U15 squad, or maybe even 2 ages to the U16 squad. I think that's the future. The best work is currently, as you may know, being done in the UK. But I think other countries, once it's tested and applied, will follow suit. So I know that they're starting to do biobanding tournaments and matches in the United States now. But I do think that we need to do more of that. But that's actually still relatively new as of, call it 2 or 3 years. The problem is, I think, that the coaches, so whatever sport that you're playing, right, the coaches have a hard time allowing the players to play up or play down. It's more of just kind of a logistical challenge that needs to be in agreement, because let's just say this: the U14 team is saying, yes, we need to play up a level, play down a level, but the U15 team is saying, no, 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 we're not doing that. I'm working just with my team, right? But that's the problem in the academy structure that I found over the last couple of years, is that the U13 team is doing something that, different than the U14. The U14 is doing completely different things than the U15, and it's just not integrated, so to speak. So yes, I think that's the future. And I do believe that players can benefit from playing up certain levels or playing down certain levels. 100%. Very good question.
All right, guys, I'll intervene here. Thank you so much, Nicole, for your time. I'm sure we are running short of time. So one question that I want to ask you, which I might get back from all the participants, is that what did you think about this webinar?
Well, first off, our time went by really fast. I really felt that you guys were well prepared to ask good questions. I will honestly say you guys asked very good questions from start to finish. So I enjoyed this format. But I think it was not because of me, but I think it was because of you guys, to be honest. I think you guys did a really good job putting some time and effort and some thought. So, because someone once told me, there's no such thing as bad answers, there's bad questions. So I thought you guys did a really great job asking some relevant and real questions. And I think I'm still going back to the first 2 questions about the free play, and I just think that those are more resources that we need to create, and teaching people how to insert free play into our semi-structured and structured organizations. The only thing is, when it comes to that, when you're trying to add free play into a structured environment like an academy, it's actually very tool intensive. You need a lot of tools to implement free play. You're not just going to throw them in the corner and ask them to play their own game. So I enjoyed the webinar, but partly because, or a lot because, you guys asked fantastic questions. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you all for being a part of this. There was a technical glitch initially, and even after the glitch, we have about 19 participants, so which is great. So, and all of them were very engaging. I never thought this would go this smooth, and I totally loved it. Maybe we can host a part 2 in the future.
For sure, anytime. Thank you guys, and thank you for organizing. But thank you guys for joining us and spending some time, because I think that's the most valuable thing that we have. So thank you guys for spending time with us.
When do we see you in India?
Ooh, no plans. I've never been, but no current plans. So we'll let this world situation get by us, because I think it's really it's very difficult for us all, and we'll see. Maybe in the near future. Yes.
Absolutely. Surabhi, would you like to say something? I saw your hands going up.
No, I wanted to ask the same question. When will you be coming to India? Same question, yeah.
Yeah. No, like I said, no plans yet, but you know, maybe we can create the right opportunity. Never been, and always enjoy going to new places. I've traveled quite a bit in my career, but never to India. So
We will plan it for you. Don't worry.
awesome. Good.
All right. Thank you so much, Nicole, and thank you all for participating in this. It's been an amazing chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abhinav.
Catch
Thank
up
you.
soon.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.